I did want to share with you a story, because you won't hear about this in the Undertaker documentary. But he has been making the media rounds to promote it. And he appeared on ESPN Radio with Peter Rosenberg, who asked him about the Survivor Series incident. Now, actually, he asked him about 2 Survivor Series incidents, but the main one that I was more interested in, was the Survivor Series incident in 1991 with Hulk Hogan. Now, if you've never heard the story before, Paul Bear talked about it in a shoot interview. At least once he talked about this, that he did, an interview he did many years ago. It's Survivor Series 91. Undertaker has been in the company for a year at this point. He debuted at Survivor Series 90. Here we are at 91. He's already challenging Hulk Hogan for the World Championship. The gravest challenge. That's how they build the match. Hulk Hogan against The Undertaker in the gravest challenge. He tombstones Hogan onto a chair, slid into the ring by Ric Flair, and he becomes, at the time, the youngest WWE champion of all time. Undertaker was only 26 years old when he beat Hulk Hogan to win his first championship. He was the youngest man ever to hold the title up until that point, until Yokozuna beat Bret Hart at WrestleMania 9. I think he beat Undertaker by about 2 months to become the youngest champion. And then he was the youngest champion of all time. So you gotta figure, right? Undertaker's on cloud 9. He's in the company for 1 year, young guy. He's already working with guys like Hogan and Flair. Now he's the champion. He bought his first motorcycle after that title win. I guess he treated himself. Got a nice payday out of it. He's on top of the world. Or he was, until Hogan beat him and took the title back a week later. But Paul Bear said that Hogan faked a neck injury on that tombstone spot. Undertaker didn't know that he was faking at the time. He came to the back. He felt horrible, thinking that he had just injured their golden goose. He was probably worried that his career was over. And it wasn't until days later that somebody, it might have been Bear, showed him the tape of that spot, and all of his feelings of sadness and regret turned to anger. So I was really happy that Rosenberg asked him about this, because now we get to hear it from the man himself and not from his manager, who I trust. After all, it was Paul Bear who revealed that the Undertaker's disgust, his distaste for cucumbers. And we have since gotten confirmation of that from the Undertaker as well. I love how we're finally getting confirmation on all of these stories. This is the best part about the Undertaker doing all of these interviews. He talked to Bill Simmons about being upset, backstage in Montreal after the screw job. All of these stories that we've heard over the years. He needs to write a book or start a podcast and tell more stories. Dead man talking. Anyway, Undertaker says, looking back, it was a setup from the very start. And you can, again, the clip is on, I think it's on the ESPN channel if you want to find it. I know not everybody is going to, so I will happily regale you with the story here, because I just love shit like this. But he says, looking back, it was a setup from the very beginning. Back then, said most of the guys would get to the building for a show like a TV or a pay-per-view at around noon is when you would get to the building. Noon, 1 o'clock. I don't think it's all that different now. I think you still have to get to the building around that time. He said Hogan, being the top guy, he would usually come strolling in about 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. And the day of Survivor Series in 91, he was already there when Undertaker had gotten to the building, which he thought was kind of strange. And he comes up to Undertaker, and he says, "Hey, can I talk to you for a minute?" And they go into the showers. Every time I hear about guys stepping into the showers for a conversation, I always think of Bruiser Brody. I always think about Bruiser Brody's death. Thankfully, Hogan did not shank The Undertaker in the shower, which probably wouldn't have worked anyway, right? Because he was already dead. But they step into the shower, and Hogan tells him, "I've got this neck injury, and I'm really nervous about taking your finish." And Undertaker tells him, "Dude, don't worry. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. I'm going to have you so tight your neck's going to be fine, I promise you." And then Hogan said, okay, brother. And he goes off, and he said for the rest of the day, for the next several hours, anytime he would see Hogan or Hogan would see him in the hallway, or they would pass by each other, Hogan would like pantomime, like, oh, my neck, don't forget about my neck. He would point to his neck, don't forget about my neck. So if you watch the finish when he drops him in the match for the Tombstone, and he knew he had him tight. Like, if you go back and watch it, Hogan's head did not come anywhere near the mat. He was a good 4 or 5 inches away from that chair. And as soon as Undertaker's knees hit the mat, he says he hears this from Hogan. He hears, oh, you got me, brother. And you can see, if you watch it back, Hogan does say something to him. Hogan mouths something to the Undertaker. Undertaker says, yeah, he was saying, oh, you got me, brother. And Undertaker, at that moment, before the referee even hits the 3, before Earl even hits the 3 count, he's mortified. He's devastated. He can't understand how he hurt this guy. But now he thinks he's just killed the biggest star in the business, and he's absolutely crushed. And think about how shitty that must have been for him. You know, here he is, the biggest moment of his young career, and it's ruined. It's ruined because all he can think about is, I just injured Hulk Hogan. And also, my career is probably over. My big push is probably out the window because they'll never trust me again in a big spot like this. Or they think I'm reckless. They gave me the ball to run with and now they're going to take it away from me. And he even said, you know, when he found out that he was dropping the title to Hogan, a few days later, it was maybe about a week later, the following week, at that Tuesday in Texas pay-per-view. He knew they were doing a show. That was kind of the whole experiment to see running a show on a Tuesday night, a pay-per-view. How would it do? This was long before WWE had a Taboo Tuesday pay-per-view, which I think 2004, I think, or something, when they debuted that. Obviously, the experiment in 91 did not go well because they didn't do another one for 14 years? 15 years? But he knew they were doing a show. He had heard about the show. But he found out very late that they were switching the title back to Hogan. And nobody ever explained to him why. He never got any kind of an explanation why they were doing that. And his only thought was, okay, it's because of what I did to Hogan. They're taking the title away from me. Now, looking back at it, it was probably just storyline shit because then Hogan got stripped. That led to the 92 Rumble. Thank God. So I certainly don't have an issue with it looking back. But you could see where he would think he would put 2 and 2 together and say, oh boy, I blew it. Now, if you remember that pay-per-view, the Survivor Series, Hulk Hogan was laying in that one spot where he landed. He was laying in that spot, didn't move for like 5 or 6 minutes after the match ended. He sold the shit out of it. Like he really did. You would think the guy really did break his neck. The announcers mentioned that very same morning, earlier that day, Hogan had visited one of the Detroit Lions players in the hospital who had just been paralyzed in an accident during a game, Mike Utley. I always get Utley and Dennis Byrd confused, but it was Mike Utley. He had just visited Utley in the hospital, and the announcers are on commentary drawing Monsoon and Heenan. They're on commentary drawing parallels between the two. Bobby Heenan says, well, maybe Hogan will get a bed right next to him now in the hospital. Hogan eventually walks out on his own power. He looks all shaken up. Undertaker goes looking for him. And he finds him laying on the floor in Vince McMahon's office. And he says Hogan is moaning. He wants to talk. He wants to talk to him. Undertaker wants to go over and talk to him, but here come the paramedics. And he's thinking, well, you know, it's still the era of kayfabe. I don't want them to come in and see the Undertaker talking to Hulk Hogan. So he goes and there's like a wall, I guess, nearby. He goes and hides behind this wall. And Shane McMahon is there. Shane McMahon is right next to him. And so he's listening to the paramedics. He's eavesdropping. He's listening to the paramedics, asking Hogan all kinds of questions. Can you feel this? Can you feel that? And he hears Hogan go, oh, somebody get my wife and kids on the phone. Somebody get my wife and kids on the phone. You would think the guy was shot. You would think he got shot by like a spectator or something. Oh, go get my wife and kids. My final words. I want to say I got to say I love you before it's all over. Call my wife and kids. When you think back to this, how ridiculous this whole situation was. Somebody get my wife and kids on the phone. Good grief. So Undertaker hears this. He is beside himself with grief because he thinks he hurt Hogan. And Shane turns to him. Shane McMahon turns to the Undertaker and just goes, Mark, his head wasn't anywhere close to hitting that mat. Even Shane saw that, and he knew. But Undertaker, he didn't believe it. He just thought, what have I done? He told me not to hurt him. I betrayed that trust. I went out there and I hurt this poor guy. So Undertaker goes on to defend the title a few times. He defended the title like 3 or 4 times, I think. In that 6-day span before he dropped it, he defended it against the British Bulldog a few times. So they get to this Tuesday in Texas. And that's where he finally saw the tape. Because back then, as he says, you didn't have social media. They didn't have instant access to see a replay of what had happened. So it was almost a week before he even saw the footage for himself. It was that day when he finally found out the truth. So he sees it, he goes, Now he's got to go confront Hogan about it because he needs to know. He needs to know, hey, what's going on here? But he also knows that he's taking a risk by confronting this guy and potentially causing a scene. I mean, it's Hogan, right? So you got to be careful. Sees Hogan. He goes over to him. He goes, hey, Terry, I watched it back, the finish of the match. Your head never hit. Like, what's the deal? And Hogan says, well, brother, you see, what happened is you had me hooked so tight, I couldn't move. I had nowhere to go. And that's what jammed my neck. And that's when The Undertaker had his Eureka Moment. When it came to Hulk Hogan. Like the light bulb in his head went off. He could see clearly now. And he said at that point, he knew what Hogan was all about. And how Hogan did business. And so when Hogan came back to the company many years later in 2002, if you remember, the two of them worked together. He treated him, he said, with the respect that he felt someone of his status deserved. Hogan was a legend. Hogan helped build that company and was a huge megastar, did a lot of business. And so he paid him the respect that he felt he was owed, but nothing more. He goes, he was not overly friendly with him. But from that Tuesday in Texas show in December of 1991, he knew all he needed to know about Hulk Hogan. And his radar was up every single time that he had to interact with him, talk to him. And he admitted at the end, when Rosenberg brought up the angle on Raw in 2002, where Hulk Hogan's on the motorcycle, and he goes to rev up the engine, he's going to chase after the Undertaker, but the motorcycle's sputtering, it's stalling, and then it just it won't start. They're on live TV, and it won't start. And Hogan has to get off the motorcycle and go running after the Undertaker. And he did admit, Undertaker did admit he had a nice chuckle. He was amused over that moment. But he had every right to be upset about this whole situation. I mean, he could have... think about this. You're a young guy in the business, right? You got to think on some level there was some professional jealousy there. You hear stories over the years about Hogan, and I'm sure some people it's just sour grapes. But you hear enough stories where, you know what? There are guys who are not overly negative, who will tell stories and shoot on certain people. And you hear enough stories about a guy, and you know what? There's smoke to the fire. And there's an unlimited list of Hogan stories from over the years, and you can't tell me that it's all guys who are just jealous because they weren't as big of a star as Hogan. They're all making it up. They're all lying. I hear this from The Undertaker. This is the first time Undertaker has told a story in all these media interviews where it's almost... I say it's like he's bashing him, but he did it in a very respectful way. Like you could tell, he was being very diplomatic in telling the story about Hogan. Like he could have gone off on the guy. And so, put yourself in Undertaker's situation here. I mean, Hogan could have sabotaged this guy's career with that phony story. And maybe that's what he was trying to do. He finds out he's doing the job. All of a sudden, I got a bad neck. And then after, his neck is magically okay. Hulk Hogan. Always a man of integrity. I mean, here's a man who, when I hear his theme music, it still takes me back to when I was a kid. And it puts a smile on my face. That will never get old to me. And he's been involved in some of my favorite matches, right? Some of the most iconic matches and moments in history. Nobody could ever take that away from Hulk Hogan. But you can add this to the long list of bullshit tales from the Hulkster. You held me too tight, Brother Jack Dude. You held me too tight. You held me too tight and you jammed my neck. Didn't jam his neck that badly. Since he was back in the ring 3 days later. He got over that real quick. Maybe it was all the baby oil. Maybe Undertaker had him tight, but with all the baby oil that he used to lather on, that leathery skin, he just slid right through the Undertaker's hands. And he jammed his neck. Maybe that's what happened. Undertaker also talked to Rosenberg about Montreal. Not much to it beyond the fact that he was present in the locker room when Bret punched Vince. He stayed with Shawn. He saw Shawn on the far end of the room. He made sure that Shawn was far away and kept his mouth shut because he didn't want him to start. He knew if he opened his mouth, it would start a whole thing. So it was almost like he was babysitting Shawn in the corner. But what was interesting is that he was hot. He was angry. He was upset that Vince never came to him to ask him to try to help diffuse the situation and smooth things over in advance of Montreal. When all this was going on in the week or two beforehand, nobody came to him. Vince didn't come to him. And this was during a period where he was viewed as the locker room leader. And he was really upset that they didn't come to him to say, hey, Mark, maybe you can, I hate to get you involved here, but maybe you can help smooth things over. We're having a bit of a, we're at an impasse here. And we're having some trouble. Maybe you can help out. Because he had worked with both guys and been friendly enough with both of them. He was friends with Bret. He's convinced he could have helped. If he was called upon to help, he's convinced that he could have helped. Because that was the kind of the position that he was in at that time. Or he said, I could have stepped in. I could have replaced Shawn. Could have done some kind of angle. I replace Shawn in the match. I win the title from Bret, and then I just drop it later on to Shawn myself. I hear this, and I'll just say this, and I've thought this before. Why not just make it a triple threat? I mean, I know they didn't do many of those back then. They weren't going triple threat crazy at the time like they do now with all the multi-man matches. Although they did do a Final Four match on pay-per-view earlier that year. But, I mean, Undertaker was already involved in the feud, right? He lost to Bret at SummerSlam, got screwed out of the title, had back-to-back pay-per-view matches with Shawn, including the Hell in a Cell. He was in the thick of it. He was involved in that feud with both guys. Undertaker was there in Montreal that night, yet he didn't even have a match. He wasn't on the card. You could have made it a triple threat and just had Shawn pin Undertaker, so Bret doesn't have to eat the pin. But who knows? Who knows? Maybe Bret wouldn't have wanted to do that either. Maybe his whole thing is Shawn can't leave with the belt. Who knows? We'd have to ask Bret. But I am loving these Undertaker stories. It represents the last vestiges of kayfabe. But I do love that we're finally getting him out there telling stories.